Okay, let's begin. Welcome to How to Decide Which Apartment is Best to Buy. Thanks for coming, and we hope this presentation will not only be informative, but will help you earn lots of money. This webinar is presented by NAREA, the National Association of Real Estate Advisors. And we educate real estate professionals and investors all over the country on how to list, lease, invest, buy, and sell real estate, particularly commercial real estate. There are two ways to become a member of NAREA. You can join for free as a basic member, or you can sign up as a pro member for $199 a year. All members receive our quarterly e-newsletter publication, NAREA News. Plus, they have access to the media center and the discounts from affiliate partners. Pro members get the added benefits of receiving discounts on our designation program, which is called Certified Commercial Advisor, CCA. And they get other high-level educational classes, plus they can access our investment analysis tools, commercial contracts and forms. And some have been taking advantage of a new thing we've had coming out for several months called Real Facts, where we prepare a newsletter, monthly newsletter that you can send to your clients, talking about all things relating to real estate and investing. It's a pretty good program. It costs about $20 a month. But pro members also get a personal profile on our website, nareagroup.org. My name is Ken Holman. I'll be the presenter today. I'm president of both NAREA and Overland Group, Inc., which is our company. I have an undergraduate degree in accounting from BYU and an MBA from the University of Utah. And I hold several of the top real estate industry designations, including CCIM, CCA, which is our designation, CPM, and CRS. It's funny, all of them start with a C. I don't know why that's the case, but a little about Overland. We specialize in both commercial and residential real estate brokerage. We also do development, construction, management, and a lot of investing. We've developed about every property type, but particularly like apartments and self-storage units. Recently, we completed raising $6 million for development and construction of a new $24 million, 116-unit apartment project in St. George, Utah, called Coyote Creek Apartments. And that's currently under construction. And our next raise that's coming up in a little while will be for a $52 million, 240-unit apartment development that we're doing in Mesa, Arizona. Let me introduce two of our outstanding team members who have helped us with this presentation today, Brittany Johnson and Stephanie Sampson. Brittany and Stephanie, why don't you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hi, I'm Brittany, and I'm the executive director for NAREA. I'm responsible for the day-to-day operations, including managing all sales efforts, ensuring customer service standards are high and continually improving.
And I'm Stephanie. I am the marketing and media director. I oversee all online content creation for the NAREA website, newsletter, and social media pages. My job is to keep the information displayed on our site fresh, informative, and appealing.
All right, thanks, guys. Since this is a relatively short presentation, we're going to hold the questions until the end, but if you do have a question, click on the Q&A button that you'll see on the screen and type in your question, and we'll try to answer those at the end of the class. I do want to give a warning, however, this class has lots of numbers. We're going to be talking about financial metrics, which uses numbers and formulas to analyze projects. It's not going to be difficult, but you need to be prepared to see lots of numbers. You may not like it quite as well as watching your favorite football team on TV, but I think it'll make you more money than that. So today we're going to discuss how to decide which apartment is best to buy. And we're looking at 8 different apartment property metrics. That's the first thing we'll kind of go over. Then we'll create what's called a comparative matrix to determine which apartment might be best to buy. And finally, we're going to look at some other factors that you'll want to consider when making a decision like this. There are generally 2 types of analyses that are performed when you decide which property you want to purchase. The one most people are familiar with is called investment analysis. The other one that fewer people are familiar with but is equally important is called property analysis. In commercial real estate, investment analysis is used to determine the potential return on an investment. Investment analysis comes into play after you've narrowed your selection down to 1 or 2 properties. It uses property metrics such as cash on cash return, return on investment, internal rate of return, modified internal rate of return, net present value. These all use a cash flow model, which we'll introduce today, but we won't be spending much time on investment analysis metrics. Today, we're going to talk about property analysis metrics. Property analysis, or some people call it property evaluation, takes several comparable properties and evaluates them to determine which one is best for further consideration. So these metrics that we're going to be talking about are the ones that will help you narrow the selection process or the selection choices from several competing options to just down to 1 or 2. And those can then be evaluated further to determine if they would make a suitable investment. So let me give you an example. And I have this happen to me all the time. Say a client comes to you and says, I've heard that apartments are a good investment and I have $500,000 cash and I'd like to buy an existing apartment complex. Can you help me? I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but it happens to me all the time. I was giving a presentation at an investment summit and a dentist came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, I own 4 duplexes in the Midwest and they've been okay investments, but I'm kind of tired of small properties and I'd like to sell them and invest in a bigger property. And then just 2 days ago, an agent brought in a couple to meet with me. The couple was an attorney and his wife, and they have $500,000 that they want to invest in real estate instead of the stock market. So the question I have for you is, how do you help somebody in that situation? Well, if you're purchasing an existing property, it's a little bit like buying a used car. When you approach this situation, the first thing you do, and we're going to use this car analogy, but the first thing you do is you narrow down the range of your choices. You look at different automobiles that are in a certain price category. Then you get on the internet and you do some evaluation. You determine which type of car you want to buy. Then you go to Kelley Blue Book and get a range of prices. And then you usually go to someplace like Carfax to look at things like the cars that are available and the history and stuff like that. And then after you do all that, You compare your choices using certain criteria, such as age, mileage, price, condition. Then you usually make your selection. Well, buying an apartment's a little bit more complicated, but the process is about the same. Here's how I approach a decision-making process when it comes to evaluating apartment properties. First, I gather as much information as I can from the investor, and I ask questions like, how much cash do you have to invest? What type of property do you want to invest in? Do you want to go it alone, or would you be willing to have other partners? Do you want to leverage your investment by taking on some debt? And if so, is your credit good enough that you can be a guarantor on a loan? And once you've asked these questions and got answers that you're satisfied with, you're ready to start the search process. After you've determined how much they have and what they're looking for, you need to calculate how big a property they can purchase with the money they have. So let's say you have a client with 500,000 cash, and they're willing to take on some debt to leverage their investment and get a better return to buy probably a bigger property than they've been in the past. The question becomes, how big a property can they reasonably expect to buy with 500,000 cash? So it's relatively easy to calculate the size of property they can afford. Most lenders will let you borrow about 75% of the value of the asset. So you take the 500,000, which represents the equity in the deal, divide it by 0.25 to come up with the overall amount that they could buy, and that represents about 2 million. Then you divide that by an estimated cost per unit. In this case, I've picked 100,000, and that then gives you the number of units you can buy. So in this case, we've estimated they can buy a $2 million property, and that would be about 20 units in size. So the next step, after you get that information, is to get on LoopNet or CoStar or some other listing service to find out what's available for sale. Then you do a property analysis to compare the properties you found. And this is done by using the following 8 property metrics: capitalization rate, occupancy rate, gross rent multiplier, occupancy rate, operating expense ratio, operating expenses per unit, price per unit, price per square foot, and rent per square foot. The way I want to present these metrics is to kind of give a definition of each one, and then we're going to look at the comparative matrix and start comparing how one property differs from another property. So our first metric is capitalization rate. Many people call it cap rate. It calculates a potential return on the investment, assuming that you're purchasing the property for all cash. To get the cap rate, you divide the net operating income by the purchase price. So the first thing you need to do is determine the net operating income for the property. So let's look at how that's calculated. We're using a very simple cash flow model to calculate the net operating income. And that's taking the gross scheduled income, assuming the property is 100% occupied, subtracting any vacancy or credit loss, adding any other income to get effective gross income. And then you subtract the operating expenses to get the net operating income. And that's the number that you want to use. So you need 4 things to calculate the cap rate. You need the purchase price, you need the gross scheduled income, the vacancy amount or vacancy rate, you need the operating expenses. And notice that in this model, we don't use the annual debt service or mortgage payments, nor do we use things like depreciation, which are basically paper losses. This is simply an annual cash calculation. Most people use what's called the IRV formula when they calculate the cap rate. It's just a simple equation that has three variables: income, rate, and value. The I in the equation stands for the net operating income, which is the income left over after all operating expenses have been paid. The R represents the cap rate, and the V is the value of the the purchase price of the property. So to get the cap rate, you divide the net operating income by the purchase price or the value, and you usually get these two numbers, which are given on the commercial listing. That determines the rate. If you want to determine the value, you simply divide the income by the rate. And if you don't know the cap rate, a general rule of thumb for apartments is 6 or 7%. So that's called the IRV formula. So because I divided the I by the R, and that equals the V. So now let's evaluate three hypothetical properties that I've selected. Oh, let me go through maybe giving you a few things on pros and cons of these different metrics. Every metric has its pros and cons. The biggest pro for the cap rate is that almost all investment properties are valued and compared using it. That helps everybody talk the same language. And the biggest con is that a small change in a cap rate can make a huge change in value. So here's three properties, property A, B, and C. I hope everybody appreciates the fact that I did such a good job coming up with the name for these three properties. But most listings will contain all the following information: the purchase price, the number of units, square footage, gross scheduled income at 100% occupancy. Then they have a vacancy rate or vacancy amount that gets subtracted from the GSI to get the effective gross income. And then you subtract from that operating expenses to get the net operating income. You might want to take a screenshot or a picture of this slide because we're going to be referring to it over and over again as we calculate the upcoming formulas. You don't need to, but it might be helpful. So some listings will give you square feet per unit rather than the total square footage, or they might give you the vacancy rate or the operating expense percentage rather than the actual numbers. But regardless, if you have these 8 things, you can calculate every formula that we're going to talk about today. So let's calculate the cap rate. And I show the formula here as net operating income divided by purchase price or value equals the cap rate. So you simply take the NOI, divide it by the list price. As a buyer, the higher the cap rate, the better the deal, because it represents your return on investment. So in this case, we have these three properties. I've given the NOI and the value and the cap rates for each. Property A is 5.9%, property B is 6.9%, and property C is 6.5%. So obviously the one with the highest cap rate is the best if you're a buyer. If you're a seller, you're trying to sell at the lowest cap rate because that gives you the highest price. But as a buyer, you want to buy at the lowest price. So the higher the cap rate, the better. So then after we get that, we rank these on what I call a comparative matrix. And we build on this, we're going to build on this matrix as we go. But so property B had the best cap rate, property C next, and property A was the worst of the three. So now let's look at gross rent multiplier. I don't see this metric used much with larger commercial properties. I see it used most often on smaller residential properties. But you calculate this metric by dividing the purchase price by the gross scheduled income. And in our example, here's a gross scheduled or gross rent multiplier for each property. A is 9.3, B is 8.7, and C is 10.2. So in this case, property C is the best. So it'll be ranked as number 1, and then A and B 2 and 3. And now we add that to the matrix that we've created. Now we're going to look at occupancy rate, or its corollary, vacancy rate. We're doing a comparison here. So the property with the highest occupancy rate or the lowest vacancy rate will be number 1. You just take the units occupied divided by the total units to get the occupancy rate. And the cash flow model subtracts the vacancy rate or the vacancy amount from the gross scheduled income. However, occupancy rate is a very important metric, and generally the higher the occupancy rate, the better the project. Sometimes if you have a low occupancy rate, that might represent a value add opportunity. But if you have 18 out of 20 units rented, you'd have an occupancy rate of 90%. So in this case, in our example, you can see the occupancy rates of 91%, 93, and 95%. So property C has the best occupancy rate, and property A has the worst. So we add that to our comparative matrix, and you're beginning to see maybe how these things are lining up. So it begins to give you a feel for what property might be best. The operating expense ratio divides the total operating expenses for the project by its effective gross income. And in this case, property A has the highest operating expense ratio. This is typical for older properties, primarily because they require more maintenance and they tend to be less energy efficient. So property C again has the best operating expense ratio. And on the comparative metrics, it would show up there as well. You start to see a little pattern emerging here. By the way, on this comparative matrix, it's a little bit like golf. The property with the lowest score wins. For this metric, that's a mistake. So I've said occupancy expenses per unit. That's operating expenses per unit. Sorry, I mislabeled this. So we're looking at operating expenses, not occupancy expenses. And you get that ratio by dividing the total number of the operating expenses by the total number of units. And in this case, all 3 properties are really close to the same. Property A is 3494, property B is 3515, and property C is 3420. That's the operating expenses per year on an annual basis. And when something is that close, it's pretty hard. We can rank them still 1, 2, and 3, but I probably wouldn't put that necessarily on the matrix because you start double count a little bit in some of these. So on the comparative matrix, I just put 0, saying they're all the same. Not one is better than the other. So you haven't disadvantaged any property in your evaluation when you do something like that. So the next metric, price per unit, is calculated by dividing the purchase price or the list price by the total number of units. And when we first got started, I chose 100,000 a unit to determine the number of units the investor could purchase. Usually the older the property, the lower the per unit price. So I see newer properties ranging as high as $175,000 to $200,000 per unit. You won't see that for existing lower end apartment deals, but we're building a new upscale property in Mesa that I mentioned, 240 units. And the purchase price per unit on that 4-story property is coming in just over 200,000 a unit. So the only good thing about it is we're getting the rents to support that, but that also includes an underground parking garage. So obviously, when you purchase a property, you'd think that the lower the purchase price, the better. This metric doesn't always hold true. A lower purchase price per unit may mean that you've got more fix-up required. It also means that the property usually has lower rental rates. And in this case, property A won the day at 89,583. So on our comparative matrix, that's how we'd rank them, 1, 2, and 3. And I like the metric price per square foot because it gives a real accurate picture of what your cost is. And you simply take the purchase price and divide it by the total square footage for the project. And this is generally a really good metric to use. Older properties tend to have a lower price per square foot, while newer properties have a higher price per square foot. On more expensive properties, I've seen price per square foot exceed $200 a foot, some even higher for condo deals. But in this case, property A has the best price per square foot at 90 bucks a foot. Sometimes when you use a comparative matrix, it may give you a false indication of which property is best. For instance, in this example, property A comes in with the lowest price per unit and the lowest price per square foot. But that may just be that it's an older property and the price has been marked down to reflect a lower value because the property may need repairs. So don't let that throw off your overall evaluation. But I've seen this calculation, rent per square foot, handle a bunch of different ways. For most commercial buildings, like office buildings and industrial properties, excluding apartments, the gross scheduled income divided by the total square footage gives you an annual rent per square foot, and that's how it's quoted. Apartments are a little bit different. Both apartments and other residential properties are a little unique when you calculate rent per square foot because it's most often quoted on a monthly basis rather than an annual basis. And that means you have to take the annual rent per square foot and divide it by 12 to get an accurate comparison with other properties. I've also seen this number stated on a per unit basis as opposed to an overall project basis. So I see older properties running below $1 a foot, while newer properties command a higher rent per square foot. In some of the larger metro areas, rent per square foot could range even as high as $2 and $3 a foot. At $3 a foot, that means basically that you're paying $3,000 in rent for a 1,000 square foot apartment unit. Now let's put these metrics to use to analyze the 3 properties to determine which property might be the best. Property C has the best rent per square foot, which would make sense because it's the newest and has the highest price per unit. And once we add that to our metrics or our matrix, we now can take those and total them and come up with a number that we think might represent which property has the best or would be the most likely one you'd want to purchase. And in this case, property C comes in with a number of 12, property B with 14, property A is 16. So it would suggest that using these project matrix or metrics, that property C would be our best one. But you shouldn't end your evaluation there. There's a lot of other factors that you should consider when you're making a decision like this. The 5 that I consider are the most important are location, age, physical condition, parking, and tenant leases. And each of these play a major role in determining which property is best. I can't overemphasize how important location is. You've heard the adage, location, location, location. Well, it's true, and they wouldn't keep saying it if it wasn't. But age is somewhat relative. If a property's been well maintained, it might not be a deterrent to purchasing it. Physical condition usually reflects the amount of capital improvements that are required to bring the property up to a certain standard. And parking when it comes to residential property is critical. Can't overemphasize how important it is to have more parking spaces instead of fewer. If you have too few parking stalls, then that can be a real deterrent to being able to rent the units. And finally, by reviewing the tenant leases and the rent roll on how they pay, you can tell when the leases expire, you get a feel for whether or not the tenants are paying on time. And a property with more long-term leases obviously tends to be more stable and have less turnover. So I put a value on each of these just to show how that would work in a comparative matrix. And this is all subjective. I just came up with this to kind of reinforce the concept that we're teaching today. And so property A had the best location. Property C was the newest and the best condition. I also said that property A had the best parking ratio, but property C probably had, property C had the best tenant leases. So once you take all these factors into consideration, it would appear that property C comes out as the clear winner. Now, obviously, this is a hypothetical and it's a little canned, so I've been able to massage the numbers to come out with what I want to see. But you'd be surprised in real life how this really works. More often than not, by going through this type of an analysis, you can identify which property you want to recommend to your client to purchase. So there's just one final thing that I think we should talk about before we end today, and that's the market area life cycle. Not very many people talk about this, but I think it's really critical when you're looking at properties, especially older properties. Every neighborhood where these properties are located are in some stage of the market area life cycle. I'm sure in your community you can point to areas where the market is growing and other areas where the market is in decline. And after you consider all these factors that we've mentioned before, well, you ask yourself if this property is in a growing, stable, declining, or revitalizing neighborhood. And this could be one of the overriding reasons why you select a certain property. Because obviously, if you're in a growth or stable area, you're going to have an opportunity to have value appreciate. When you're in a declining or revitalizing market, maybe that might not be the case. So I hope you've enjoyed the class today. And even though we've been through a lot of numbers, we'd like to invite you to join us on NAREA. Basic membership is free, or you can buy the pro membership for $199 a year, which gives you a bunch of added benefits. But you can see our website, and you're welcome to go there and sign up. Before we go, if there's any questions out there, let me look and see what might be coming up. And we have a little poll while we're going through the Q&A that we'd like you to fill out if you would be so kind. It helps us improve our presentations as we go along. So
I'd like to know if we have this in a printout.
Yeah, Toby, we do have this, not only maybe so much in a printout, but we will send you an actual copy of the webinar that we've given today. It'll show all the slides and that'll help. So awesome. Christian, I was wondering the same thing. Thank you for sending it. So it looks like, hey, everybody's excited about seeing the slide presentation. We really appreciate that. Okay.
And Paul wants to know any comments on the valuation of land purchase for multifamily.
Okay, valuation of land purchase for multifamily. Yes, I do have several comments on that because we're in the development business. There's actually two kind of diametrically opposed things that are going on. You can't overpay for the land, and usually land is valued obviously at price per acre, price per square foot. But when you're talking about apartments, it's usually price per unit. Some people say price per door, but I try to stay in the range of 10 to 15,000 per unit if I can. If you start getting up above that, it's a lot more difficult to purchase the property and make the numbers work and to get the return you want. The flip side of that is location is extremely important. So you want to buy the best piece of property you can find for your project. And I am not opposed to paying fair market value for a piece of property if it's got to necessarily try to get the cheapest price. I'm more interested in getting the best location.
Okay, Carlos wants to know, when deciding between a Class B or C apartment complex, which plays a factor on your decision?
Okay, Class C properties, in terms of talking about classes, a lot of times you're talking about amenities, you're talking about construction, you're talking about location. Those determine the difference between, and generally age. That determines the difference between A, B, and C classes. So, and a lot of times when you're doing value add deals, you're bottom fishing, you're going after the cheapest property you can find that most potential to increase. And so between a Class B and a Class C, I don't see much difference. The things that affect it for me is obviously location, age. It's really imperative that you get, we mentioned that market area, life cycle. You want to be in an area that's growing. A lot of times Class C properties are in a declining area, and that can cause some issues. So those are the main factors I look at.
Okay, Brandon wants to know where he can get in the forms that we use to analyze the properties. Do they come with a paid subscription?
So, pardon me, we have investment in major property types, apartment, industrial, office, and what's the other one? Multifamily, yeah. Well, I said apartments, though. So retail. So we have investment analysis forms for each of those. You get on, they ask questions, you fill out the form, and it self-populates and will actually go all the way through the analysis process to give you internal rates of return, things like that. So they're pretty cool. They're found on our website, nareagroup.org. To access those, you have to be a subscription member. You have to be a pro member, so you have to pay $199 a year, which we think is a pretty fair price for the value that's given.
All right, and then someone would like to know if they can get an audio or video copy of this presentation.
Yeah, we actually will send you the webinar. So it's an actual replay of the whole thing. So you're not only getting the slides that we show, but you're getting the audio as well.
Okay, and then Vaughn said you didn't discuss how to make an offer price comparable with the other properties on the market, i.e. using the cap rate you want and what the price needs to be. Who pays the asking price anyway? I understand the math on that, but others may not.
Okay, didn't discuss how to make an offer price comparable with other properties on the market using the cap rate you want. So there's different ways to use cap rates. First question is, how in the world do you find a cap rate if you don't know the NOI and you don't know the value and stuff like that? But appraisers have done this so many times, and commercial real estate brokers have been in the market so long that they have a pretty good sense of what the cap rates are in the market. And so those are good sources to ask. But as a general rule of thumb, apartments are going to be at a lower cap rate than maybe some of the other property types, just because they're so in demand. And so you can expect to be in a 6 or 7 cap range for those. So you'd pick a cap rate, you'd look at the different comparable properties that you want to compare, and then you'd take the net operating income, just divide it by that cap rate for each one to kind of give you a value. If you want to, and if you want to get a higher return, obviously you're going to use a higher cap rate, which gives you a lower value or a lower price that you'd be willing to pay. And that's how we approach it when we're buying properties, is we kind of look at what the property is listed for, come up with what we want to be as our cap rate that we're looking at, our return on our investment, and we apply that, and then we make offers based on that cap rate that we've selected.
Okay, and then Carlos says, would you purchase a Class C apartment complex to fix it up into a Class B so that when you decide to sell, you can use the Class B cap rates? Is this even possible and being done?
Would you purchase a Class C apartment to fix it up into a Class B so that when you decide to sell, you can use the Class B cap rates? Absolutely. That's the whole name of the game. Is you're trying to buy, in many cases, a property that is a lower value, fix it up, get higher rents, then apply the the cap rate. And for a Class B, it'd probably be a lower cap rate than a Class C. So you'd apply that lower cap rate, and that would give you higher value. That's exactly what people do when they're buying these types of properties.
Okay, and then Paul says, back to land. Is there a formula for land price calculating from a set number of units, percentage to soft costs, percentage to development, hard costs, and percentage apartment construction costs?
Paul, you love land. That's good. We love land. So the basic formulas that I use is I try not to pay more than 15% of my overall total cost of a new development project in land. If you get too heavy in the land, that depresses what the returns are that you can get. So I'm staying in the range of 10 to 15,000 a unit or a door. Percentage of soft costs on a apartment development usually runs in the neighborhood of 15% of the total cost, with 85% being more of the development hard costs. Sometimes those soft costs go up depending on contingency reserves that you put in there. Could creep up to 20%, but you're somewhere in that 80-20 range for hard costs versus soft costs. And in terms of apartment construction costs, you're probably not asking about construction costs per square foot, but I'm seeing those on new developments ranging in the neighborhood of the high 100s to low 200 per square foot cost.
Okay, and then Toby says, how do you convince the seller that their list price should be based on actual income, not estimate future income?
Oh, Toby, this is the $84,000 question. It's what everybody tries to do. If you're a listing broker, you're out there looking at how much this property is generated, and obviously you're probably not going to get the price that you want, and the owner's probably not going to list with you if you use his actual numbers. So they all play the game of throwing on estimated numbers or pro forma numbers or projected income. And I do this through the due diligence process when I make an offer. I always make it subject to obviously my due diligence and an appraisal and some things like that. But that's when I really begin to drill down, because I want those actual numbers. I don't want somebody's estimate and some off the wall cap rate or some value that's 20% higher than the So that's where you have to really start digging. You do need to get actual income and never rely on estimates of future income. That'll get you every time.
Okay, Vaughn says, I think that the revitalization phase is a good time to buy because appreciation is favorable. The peak of stabilization is a bad time because of the pending decline. The problem is determining that point in time. Revitalization is easier to see.
Yeah, you've got a good point there, Vaughn. For instance, up in Portland, I saw a downtown neighborhood that was mainly older manufacturing properties go through a whole revitalization process. The city rezoned it, allowed multifamily. People went in and did a lot of conversions on those units, made them really cool, changed the whole complex of the neighborhood. If you can identify and get into an area that's being revitalized, that's a really good opportunity. The city then helps you with your whole process because the whole neighborhood appreciates in value, and you just ride that out. And it is true, if you're at the peak of stabilization, that could be a bad time. However, you have to be careful because some neighborhoods that are really stable have been stable for years and decades. And so you just have to watch. You'll begin to see there'll be signs that a neighborhood is in decline, and that's when you got to be very careful about what you're going to buy.
Okay, and then Carlos says, do you have videos to learn how to finance unstable properties through the use of bridge loans?
Carlos, I haven't done any videos on that, but that sounds like a good upcoming webinar that we ought to do. In terms of financing unstable properties, usually an unstable property means that it's a non-performing property, or it's performing slower than you'd like it to perform. And so that is the time that you get into the bridge loan program. Our company, Overland Capital, we do that on certain properties. We're careful which ones we do it on, but sometimes we'll do a bridge loan to get you from the construction loan to the takeout loan, or a mezz loan called a mezzanine loan. That's where you just don't quite have enough capital that you need until the property hits stabilization. So you loan the difference to get you out to stabilization so that you can then refinance the property. There are companies out there that do that. We do it some, mainly on properties that we've been involved with, but there are lenders that just do that. Realize that when you get into that, you're going to be paying a lot of points and higher rates. That's where you start to get into the hard money loan business. And those range 2 points and usually around 12% interest.
Okay, then Paul says, I just visited your St. George apartment site. Wonderful location. Do you ever plan to do a webinar on syndication?
Hey, Paul, I'm glad you visited our Coyote Creek property. We're really excited about that, and that absolutely is a wonderful location. I picked that out. So how could it be anything other than that? So we do have plans to do a webinar on syndication. That's a little bit of a complicated class, but it would be really fun to do. And we've got that projected, I think, is that coming up in November? I think we've got a syndication webinar coming up in November, sometime before Thanksgiving. So yeah, thanks for asking.
All right, unless we have any other questions, that is all we have.
Thanks, everybody. It was a blast spending a few minutes with you, and hope to see you on our next webinar.